Well then, I'll hand right over to Neil.
Okay, thanks very much, Trevor, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. So what I want to start to talk about is some solutions as we look towards 2050. One of the obvious things when you look at the Earth from space is that it's mostly covered with water. So the concept of us running out of water or being short of water is not correct. But as you can see from this diagram, which I've got courtesy of Icewarm, that most of it is salt water in ocean. So a possibility of desalinating the salt water gives us one solution. If you look at the history of desalination, this is a projection that was done some years ago, but it's nonetheless typical of what is happening with the world's desalination market forecast. These figures are from Global Water Intelligence. So it is a technology that is here to stay. It is an alternative. It is more expensive naturally than traditional supplies, but is being adopted widely around the world, and they think there is something like 17,000 desalination plants that are currently active, traditionally in the Middle East, now far more widespread. In Australia, as a result of the Millennium Drought, we had a program of building desalination plants and water recycling facilities, which I'll show here progressively, for all the mainland state capital cities. I have not shown the Brisbane water recycling facility in this because this was a desalination presentation, but that was a significant piece of infrastructure that's now largely been mothballed because as soon as they built it, it rained. Now, Matt mentioned a deficit of some 800 gigalitres looking forwards to, say, 2050 with the size of the increase of the capital cities, which are adjacent to the sea. Hence, a supply of water is available for it. And if we add up the total capacity of this plus the recycling system in Brisbane, it comes to something like 700 gigalitres. So if you look, and Michael Porter later will talk looking forward 100 years, the contribution of these plants adds immeasurably to Australia's water resilience and to security of the capital cities. It's astonishing what's been achieved. There were 6 world-class desalination plants of the total cost of some $12 billion were permitted, approved in a space of 8 years. By contrast, America has just last year commissioned the Carlsbad desalination plant in California. It took 16 years to build and to permit. Now, the message in this is that the construction of the desalination and water recycling facilities in Australia was a remarkable achievement in investment in public infrastructure that has been paid for by the utilities and the consumers in the form of increased rates. There's 2 components. One is the financial cost, which is what you might consider insurance. We are insured against future water restrictions. That is certain. And secondly, there's an operating cost that's associated with the chemicals and energy and maintenance of these plants. At the moment, 5 out of 6 are operating. The one that is not is Sydney. However, there are some plans, and I think Michael may mention this, of using the Sydney desalination plant in association with Warragamba Dam, which is currently full, and they're terrified that if a big storm comes on it, it will flood most of Western Sydney. Having the desalination plant provides options. But the main thing is that as we go forward, they will be used more and more as the water supply becomes more and less certain from traditional sources. To give you an alternative, in Perth, which is currently being constructed, this is the pilot plant for the advanced water treatment facility at Beenyup wastewater treatment plant. This will take treated sewage, turn it into basically drinking water quality through a reverse osmosis and advanced oxidation process, then inject it into the aquifer, which will be picked up in some years' time through the water treatment plants at Beenyup and Mirrabooka. This plant will be ultimately built to be 28 gigalitres. The current construction is 14 gigalitres. By contrast, in Perth, the desalination capacity is 145 gigalitres. So this is only a tenth, but it's an important aspect of the diversity of supply that Perth has had to face because of the declining water supply that Matt mentioned. Last year, incidentally, it was the worst on record since they've been kept from 1911 the total reservoirs in Perth received 11 gigalitres over the year, 15 gigalitres evaporated, so the net take was minus 4 gigalitres. And you're saying it's going to even get worse in the future. The reservoirs that have water in them are because it's been pumped in from the desalination plants and the groundwater system. If we look at the impact of the desalination plants, this shows for Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth, including the water recycling facility in Brisbane, that the climate resilient water capacity in each of these cities is pretty significant. So overall it's about 30%, but in places like Adelaide, Perth and Brisbane, the capacity of the desalination is about 50% of the water supply. Now the reason these were built was because of political and natural crises, and it's just been my observation in life that things get done when you have a crisis. They probably should have been done a long time ago, but it's a big investment and nobody wants to do it, and particularly water supply seems only to be negative in terms of political. In the 50s and 60s, it was popular to build dams and people got votes from building dams, but nowadays it's the opposite. They want to get water, but nobody wants to pay for it. So the crisis instituted this widespread project, and it's a very, very large infrastructure project in Australia, and one of which I speak about at many international forums, and one of which I'm actually proud of because it was achieved in such a short time. And the other thing is that the environmental aspects of intake and outfall and impact on the marine environment have been taken care of, and they're all offset with wind energy, which makes them a bit more expensive. So how expensive? Perth's first plant at Kwinana, it costs around about $1.20 Australian per kilolitre. It's the best performing plant. It's supplied with green energy from Emu Downs, north in Western Australia, but it also, if you translate it to US dollars, is about 90 cents. The best in the world is at Sorek in Israel, that's 57 cents. So we're not too bad. The others are more expensive for reasons that they were, you know, if you want to buy an airfare to London in 6 months' time, it might cost you $1,500. If you want to buy it tomorrow, it costs you $3,000. That's why we have expensive desalination facilities in Australia, with the exception of Perth, where there was a lot of planning involved in it. This is the hall of the Victorian desalination plant, and I've just made the observation that membranes will continue to do the heavy lifting. There are other alternative types of distillation and ion exchange and electro-deionization techniques, but they're only going to be a niche market. The membranes will continue. They are improving, and the price is still coming down as time goes on. So desalination costs will continue to rise, depress slightly, but the cost of alternatives is going up. Now, what about small-scale areas? So we're looking ahead. A project that we're involved in at the Centre of Excellence was Junjunjara water supply. You can see where it is. It's one of the most isolated places in Australia. The water comes from a lens of fresh water that floats on a sea of hypersaline water. It's very limited, not very good quality. So we investigated solar-powered membrane distillation, both of which, you know, state-of-the-art processes, and got it to work. But the membrane distillation process suffered from the divalent ions, which were common in the water supply, and so it worked, but we had to stay there and watch it and acid clean it to keep it going. They are currently on tender for a reverse osmosis plant, which we recommended would also do the job at low recovery. And of course, once that happens, the community becomes secure completely for its water supply. The only downside is that they're going to power it from the diesel power station, but the cost to run the desal is very small compared to running the air conditioners in the homes. But that is a long-term solution, and if we can look more at the solar-powered desalination opportunities, because Australia's got plenty of sunshine, plenty of land, plenty of bad quality water, then I think, you know, we'll be onto something. Most of you will be familiar with the Sundrop Farms establishment at Port Augusta. So we're now growing greenhouse tomatoes at Port Augusta, but it's a solar tower, the only one in the Southern Hemisphere that provides the heat and energy and also powers a desalination plant, because the water comes from Upper Spencer Gulf, is desalinated into basically distilled water. They add the cocktails to it, which is ideal for the tomatoes, and it's hydroponically grown. 20 hectares, an enormously productive greenhouse, and they've gone on to sign contracts with Coles, so they'll be supplying tomatoes to East Coast Australia for the next 12 years. It's a bold, disruptive way of thinking. who would have thought you could grow tomatoes in Port Augusta? Incidentally, the power station, and I think I show that, I'll come back to that later. The power station has 400 jobs, 200 jobs have been created in the greenhouse. So that's an opportunity going forward. Looking at even more smaller scale things, there's an opportunity in rural areas, and we were dealing with a farmer on the west coast that had 5,000 milligrams per litre for stock watering, which is getting up towards the upper limit. If you give stock fresher water, they grow faster and they're happier. And so we did some work, we haven't built it yet, on a solar-powered, low recovery desalination system, reverse osmosis. And the principle of this is to take water out of the aquifer, extract about 10% of the fresh water out of it, and then put the concentrate back down into the aquifer, and that produces permeate. And this particular one, I think the cost turned out to be about $16,000, for which they get 1 cubic metre per day, more in summer, less in winter. The way we made it work, because you know that solar energy varies depending on where the sun is that we recharged a couple of truck batteries, and once the truck batteries were fully charged, we did a run of reverse osmosis, and then it turned itself off and flushed itself, and then it waited until the batteries were charged up again. So it overcame the variability in the photovoltaic panels. The cost of photovoltaics are coming down all the time as well, and we have a lot of interest from around the country. So traditional reverse osmosis systems for country areas have been pretty expensive, and what they've done is the purveyors will sell you a desalination plant, and usually a service contract, and it rapidly becomes unaffordable or it stops working. Just quickly, a few projects that are on the go at the moment. Wellington Dam in Western Australia, it's become salinised because of catchment clearing. It's an open channel irrigation system, so there's opportunities to replace it with a pipe system, but it depends on intercepting the upstream saline flows and desalinating them to improve the quality of the water. If that's done, there's a huge economic benefit for the state of Western Australia. Closer to home, we're working on a project on the northern Adelaide plains, which is once again disruptive, bold and imaginative, to take 20 gigalitres of Bolivar water and create a high-tech greenhouse. It's still in the early stages, but if it works, there's a big market to the north of us, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, that we ought to be able to capitalise on. And that's the project that's in hand at the moment. This was the Port Augusta shot that I took myself, which shows the old Morgan Whaler pipeline and then the old Alinta power station in the background. So 50 years ago, your water came from the pipeline and your power came from coal-fired. Now, the energy comes from the sun and the water comes from the sea. This is one of Matt's diagrams from the 5th of June. It shows about a quarter of Australia receiving 5 millimetres of rain. When you do the sums, it works out to 10,000 gigalitres. Matt's shortfall is 800 gigalitres. Sydney uses about 600 gigalitres in 1 year. So it just shows the power of nature to evaporate, basically desalinate water from the sea, transport it through the wind, and deliver it over widespread areas of Australia. So, Matt, in the future, you've been able to measure, predict, but maybe the next step is to control, and we'll solve a lot more problems then. So, can we learn from nature? Yes, I think we've come a long way, but we want to continue encouraging Australian water technology innovation, and to that end, our centre's involved in a larger project to bid for a future water CRC to continue on water technology and water research into the next 10 years. We're waiting for the government to be stabilised, and hopefully we're invited to go on to the next step, so watch this space. With that, I'll leave you with the sunset and a picture of the Adelaide desalination plant. And you notice in the background, St Vincent's Gulf. You don't get the impression that looking out over that expanse that Adelaide is short of water. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you.